Good morning. My name is Roger Bick. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Director of Air Force Civil Engineers. I'm happy to be with you this morning, and let me open with a special thank you to the 1,184 of you who have signed up and registered for the class today. We certainly appreciate you being here. In my pitch today, I hope to offer some insights into where we are in FY15, talk to you about 15 appropriations, what we expect to see after the 11 December CR, paint a picture for you of the FY15 landscape, where we are relative to FSRM in particular. Then I want to talk to you about my reflections from the OBRC that happened the 17th and 18th of November, what the commands presented, what implications we can draw from that as the OBRC is the O&M manager for our Air Force. And then discuss with you, if you will, where we think fallout will come from this year. And as I present kind of the overview of the commands presentations to the OBRC and FSRM risk, which is dependent upon a payback of an FSRM, where we think that money might be coming from. After that, I want to talk about if we get a reasonable initial distribution, where we would, how we would manage to 80-20, and then how we would manage through the end of the year, and wrap it up with some upcoming training that I think you'll be blessed by knowing is coming up. Before I do that, though, I'd like to especially call out Mr. Beverly and Mr. Hickey and the whole AMVID team that's putting on this presentation. AMVID stands for Army Video. They broadcast this in full HD through CDS, and I'd like to thank those people and the DISA network for putting this on today. A special call out also to our FM friends who solicited input and tirelessly worked to get folks to attend from the FN community, as well as our speakers. And you've already heard from General Green and Ms. Gleason. After my presentation, we'll have Mr. Jeff Sherman, and followed by Ms. Watern, and then Colonel Jim Pescia will come from FMBO, and we'll wrap it up this afternoon with 10 things you need to know about next gen going forward. So many thanks for everybody involved in the presentation here today. Let's open by discussing, and I don't have any slides today for the specific reason I wanted it to be more conversational. I really wanted to have a dialogue with those that choose to tune into this presentation about what is framing FY15 and how we should react to it to optimize FSRM equity for our Air Force. As everyone knows, we're under a CR through 11th of December. Reasonable people ask themselves, okay, what happens after 11 December? A short-term CR, a long-term CR, or maybe something different? Interestingly, in the last few days, there's been some traction in a thing called Cromnibus. Now, if you've not heard the word Cromnibus before, I certainly hadn't more than 5 days ago, but Cromnibus is CR for continuing resolution, Omnibus for all-encompassing appropriations. Cromnibus, I'll explain. Cromnibus is, again, an initiative that's getting reaction in Congress that says those that oppose the President's executive order on immigration are suggesting that perhaps after the 11th of December, an omnibus bill for 11 of the 12 appropriations might be appropriate, including defense and MILCON. That would give us essentially the authority to operate, the money to operate, but a CR for primarily the Department of Homeland Security and the Immigration Services, so that the 114th Congress can continue to react to the executive order on immigration. So I wanted to kind of maybe be the first to toss out the word Cromnibus. If you hear that, that's what's in play right now. We would benefit from that, in that an omnibus appropriation, once we get the NDAA and get the omnibus appropriation, that would give us the right to pursue initial distribution, and we could have an early initial distribution. I think that is beneficial for us in a lot of ways and could certainly help us make our 80-20, which, as you know, was problematic and kind of took an effort at the last minute to get us there last year. So what's framing FSRM in particular in FY15, and what's the landscape that we're operating under as we roll into 15? Well, first, of course, there was a 7% ERA, right? And ERA, for those of you who are in CE and used to understanding that ERA meant Environmental Restoration Account, it stands for Execution Review Account, and it's actually a bank or a set aside of funds that FM uses to guard against congressional cuts. So ERA 7%, it affected FSRM, and so we had a 7% cut from the President's budget for ERA. Combine that with a 48% cut in FSRM as another set aside to guard against emergent bills in our Air Force. So corporately, the Air Force took the position that we were going to set aside another 48% in FSRM to guard ourselves against bills that are forthcoming in FY15. So that's a 55% cut to FSRM before we get started. So 55% is where we're at as we get started. In addition, for the sustainment piece of FSRM in particular, you know that that's driven by the FISM model. And so the FISM model is the requirements generator for sustainment. And last year in FY14, the President's budget was funded at 80% of the FISM model. This year, sustainment is funded, or the President's budget is funded at 65% of the FISM model. So you got the 1-2 punch, if you will, of 55% reduction in FSRM as a set-aside, and then the President's budget being underfunded relative to the FISM model to begin with. You add that possibility, or you add that to the fiscal realities of the Budget Controls Act and the Bipartisan Budget Act that was supportive of us in FY14 and 15, but in 16 we have the possibility of sequestration again and the implementation of the Budget Control Act. So I think the 15 landscape is in many ways defined by the combination of all of that. So in 15, I think it's important that we all recognize the possibilities of deeper cuts in 16, maybe use some of the 14 successes we had that buys down 15 to allow us to concentrate on 15 execution that is supportive of the possibilities of 16 cuts relative to budget control. So all of that was, I think, acutely reflected as your MAGCOM FMAs briefed the OBRC. For those of you in the audience that don't understand the OBRC or aren't familiar with it or do not have context and maybe are asking yourself, well, what does that mean to me, a meeting in Washington? Let me kind of explain what the OBRC is and why it may be important to you at an installation level or MAGCOM level. The OBRC is the Operating Budget Review Committee. It is chaired by the Director of Financial Management Budget Operations, FMBO, Colonel Pesha, who's going to speak to you this afternoon. It is made up of two-letter representatives from all the two letters around the air staff, and in this case, the execution plans were presented to the OBRC to talk about how they were going to manage their budget in FY15. Now, coming into the OBRC, the expectation was, and let me read it to you from kind of the execution plan call, because I think it's stage setting for what the expectation was as we heard from your MAGCOM budget directors. And that was, the guidance was, command should build an executable yet flexible plan that considers the potential impacts of the out years. So the expectation, or the lens from which my comments generate, are based upon the expectation that commands would come in with balanced, executable execution plans that reflected how they were going to react to significant risk, especially in FSRM throughout the year. Interestingly, we saw a variety of presentations, and we saw risk in FSRM everywhere from a funding level of about 20% to a funding level of 71%. So you see a wide variety in the level of funding that different commands offered. Some commands took what I read to you kind of to heart, and that is we need an executable, balanced executable plan. some commands took the position that FSRM was cut so deeply that the Air Force must consider FSRM as the bill payer, and therefore it is natural to take risk in FSRM. The interesting part, I think, if you take the median risk that is FSRM, you're still in the high 20%. So funding levels are not risk, but rather funded FSRM is in the high 20s. That presumes, in some ways, a balloon payment at the end, or an attempt to meet the FSRM floor if we get one out of the NDAA, or a execution strategy that is reliant on funding FSRM in the last hours of the fiscal year. And so I think we were both blessed by that and in some ways probably challenged by that, as we received $850 million since September the 11th. So that's when money first started flowing for us from our perspective, and from September the 11th through the 30th of September in FSRM, we got $850 million back. So crosswalk that, if you will, to the 15 experience, and if we're taking significant risk in 15 up front, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we relative to a balanced execution? I would offer this also by way of OBRC reflections, and let me not call out any command specifically, but offer a conclusion based on what I thought was the best presentation. And in what I thought was the best presentation, the colonel that was offering it walked us from the 14 experience. He says, this is how I executed in 14, and here are the programmatics of that, meaning here are the things that are one-time relative to 14 that we don't need to replicate in 15. Also, 14, we were able to buy down these things in 15, making the 15 experience require this amount of FSRM. And he talked about how he went to the 4-star within the command and laid out the necessary funding for FSRM on a graduated scale that would get them to end game. And he talked about a balance within the command relative to his plan and how it was executable to keep the command fiscally solvent and ultimately not dependent on late year FSRM or fall in, if you will, late in the year. So I think all of us in the OBRC was blessed by the presentations. And they were knowledgeable, thorough. We asked the hard questions, and your budget directors did an excellent job presenting. From a CE perspective, my lens, I think they benefited when the CE MedCom RA was in the room with them. If we're taking that much risk, though, in FSRM throughout the year, I think it's a reasonable conversation to ask ourselves, where is the fall in coming from? As most of you know, the $850 million that I talked about early in previous comment was generated from largely an OCO fallout, right? So we had about $1 billion in OCO. Some portion of that fell back into the program. That was able to satisfy both MAGCOM risk and allow us to provide FCEC funding to do restoration modernization. It might be a great time also, with Jeff Sherman following me here, to give a shout out to the people at FCEC. I know when FCEC was set up, there was certain skeptics about centralization of restoration modernization and sustainment over $5 million as to whether we could carry it off centrally. And at least from our perspective, the FCEC has done a magnificent job of showing that centralization can work. But if a number of commands and our Air Force at large is depending on late year fall in to restore risk in FSRM, where is that coming from? I think the debate has some points relative to what are the historical sources of fall in, flying hours, you might add. Well, in FY15, I know the leadership, the Air Force leadership, is certainly encouraging that they fly the flying hour program, right? And so you'd have to ask yourself, do you expect a lot of fall in from there? The other thing you might ask, what about civ pay and historical source of funds, maybe at year end and under execution. Well, if CivPay is for CivPay, is there in fact fall in on CivPay? I don't know. Will there be an OCO windfall like we had last year? Probably not. That makes either internal fall in or the maybe a late term omnibus the source of fall in, right? And so I think we have to take risk in our left hand, the possibility of fall in or extra funds in our right hand, and we have to weigh that very carefully. And that's what we were looking for in the OBRC. Had that been accomplished within the major command as well. So let's just say, for example, that this Cromnibus actually comes to fruition and that results in an first quarter an appropriation, and we would get initial distribution sometime in January. What should we be doing January through the end of July? I picked the end of July because that's 80-20. As you know, 80-20 is the rule that says you have to spend 80% of your appropriation by the 31st of July within the first 10 months of the year. So no more than 20% can be spent the last 2 months of the year. And so I think we could all probably collectively agree that with this much risk in FSRM, we ought to be atrophying that risk some if we get an early appropriation. In that, restoral of our FSRM accounts earlier in the year could be supportive of our ultimate execution. And so I think that's what we should focus on going forward, and understanding those things that we could do in FY15 that would put us in the best position for the eventualities of FY16 would certainly be in our best interest. So that's kind of the landscape of where we are in FY15, and I wanted to offer you our perspective on that, as well as alert you to some additional training opportunities that we have coming up. One of the, not associated with this particular virtual training conference, but upcoming training we have on the 10th of December is Shop Rates. Shop Rates is going to be brought to you by Mr. Dennis Bly. Mr. Bly is going to be at 1400. He's going to be providing about an hour-long DCO, reimbursements and shop rates and CRIS reports are all the things that you perpetually ask for that we're very interested in providing you. So again, that's a wrap up from FY15, and we look forward to working with you throughout this fiscal year as we execute FY15 in preparation for FY16. Thank you very much.